Neil Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I'm delighted to follow old Uncle David because he was quite right in saying that my party has made a journey and probably still in the process of making that journey. I was, like him, originally opposed to the devolution settlement, but I've grown over the years to appreciate its wisdom. Not everybody in my party takes the same view as I do, and I hope I'm helping to nudge it in the same direction as most of us in this Assembly want to go. So I think that the Leader of Pride Cymru was quite wrong in saying that when we vote together against this legislative consent motion today, that we're doing so for reasons which are the polar opposite of each other. The only reason that we are going to oppose this is because of the provision to remove the requirement of a referendum to trigger income tax raising powers, which we think is a breach of faith with the Welsh people. It's been enshrined in legislation, and it should not be just tossed away as something which is of no importance. I think it's a very important question of principle. Much of this debate today has been on the basis of the success of the devolutionary settlement being based upon consensus. And we've moved with the spirit of the times, with the people of Wales, not against them. I think Hugh Rankin-Davies was quite right to refer in his speech to not rushing ahead of the people. And I recall the basis upon which we went into the European Economic Community, as it then was back in 1973, the then Prime Minister Edward Heath said this is something which should be done only with the full-hearted consent of both parliaments and peoples. That full-hearted consent was never actually sought, let alone achieved, and that's one reason why the European Union project never had the full acceptance of legitimacy which it has in other member states. And the reason why, one major reason why I'm personally opposed to Britain's membership of the EU is that it actually takes powers up to a more remote level and away from the people. And the Brexit process gives us the opportunity not just to restore to Westminster legislative powers which it had previously, but also to pass on to Cardiff, and indeed to Edinburgh, of course, and to Belfast as well, further powers which we ought to have here. So speaking for myself, I regard this bill, the Wales bill, as unfinished business. There's nobody, I suppose, in this Assembly today who imagines that this is the end of the story by any means. I think it is actually a very imperfect vehicle for achieving what devolutionists want. I think the reserve powers model is actually confusing and bound to lead to legal battles ahead, as the First Minister said in the course of his speech. I welcome the declaratory statement in the bill that the Assembly is a permanent part of the British Constitution. It is only declaratory, of course. Any Parliament can undo what its predecessors have done, but I don't suppose there is the slightest chance that that is going to happen. I think the Assembly is a permanent part now of the constitutional structure of the United Kingdom, and I personally embrace that with enthusiasm. There is a kind of iron law to these things, whereby, having been created, and we saw this in the European Union, which devoted itself to aggrandizing itself and to increasing its powers without ceasing during the whole time of our membership. And it is inevitable, therefore, that the devolution of powers to Wales in the years ahead is going to increase, not just in scope, but possibly also in pace, but I hope still within the context of a United Kingdom. The bill itself actually doesn't take us, except in the case of taxation, very much further in the direction of devolution. When you look at the ragbag of powers which are specifically devolved to us: ports policy, speed limits, bus registration, taxi regulation, local government elections and sewerage, small electricity generating projects, etc. None of these in themselves is terribly exciting, but the move to the reserve powers model in itself, whilst constitutionally I think imperfect and legally imperfect, nevertheless does contain a broad statement of principle which does take us further along the devolutionary journey. I do believe that the devolution of tax powers is a step change. And even though they're limited and are bound to be built on in the years ahead, that is a major change of constitutional principle, which has enormous repercussions. I personally am quite relaxed about income tax powers being devolved to this Assembly. I believe in tax competition between jurisdictions. We referred to this earlier on in First Minister's questions, where I referred to the advantages which the Irish Republic has obtained by its ability to have lower corporation tax rates than its neighbours, and how important that has been in helping the economic regeneration of what was a very backward part of the European Union at the beginning in the 1970s. I believe personally that we could use such powers intelligently in Wales to compensate for some of the disadvantages of geography and history which have limited the power to increase our economic potential. And this is something I know which Adam Price has frequently referred to in the debates since we've been here in the last 6 months, and which I've got a great deal of sympathy. And bringing government closer to the people is an important principle, in my view. And broadly speaking, this Assembly has, I think, managed to achieve that. Whether the people at large would agree with my assessment, I don't know. And if there were to be a referendum today on extending the Assembly's powers still further, I don't know what the result would be. I don't know what the view of the people of Wales is upon us collectively as an institution and the way in which we've conducted affairs in this Assembly. But nevertheless, I do believe that whilst the broad principles of the bill are worthy of support, the way in which this has been handled has been very far from perfect. And in regard to the removal of a referendum provision in relation to the devolution of income tax powers, I believe that that is a constitutional deficiency which we ought not to ignore. And so I agree broadly that with the approach which was taken by the Leader of Plaid Cymru in her speech, that it's with a bit of a heavy heart that we will be voting against this legislative consent motion today, because I accept what she said about the sincerity of all those who have been involved in bringing forward this imperfect vehicle. Yes.
Thank you very much for taking the intervention. You've welcomed quite a lot that's in the bill today. And I remember at the end of the last term, in response to challenges raised by Lee Waters in our debate on the Autism Act, that you countered him by saying, don't make the best the enemy of the good. And I'm wondering, as devolution can't stand still, that's the reason why we have this Wales bill in the first place, whether you think process is a sufficient reason for you not to take your own advice on this particular matter.
Well, I think it's a different question altogether. What the point at issue in relation to the autism bill was, what the point that's been raised today by Andrew R.T. Davis, for example, was just about why have a trade union bill rather than an autism bill. That is a choice which has been made. And in relation to what Lee Waters said, I'm not going into the merits of that decision. I'm merely making a question about process. And in relation to an intervention from Lee Waters in an earlier debate about the autism bill, then I think this is rather a different process, because this is an obligation to consult the people, not just a decision which is made by us as members of this Assembly. This is a major constitutional change, the devolution of income tax raising powers. The people were promised, and it was enshrined in legislation, the right to decide for themselves, not us deciding on their behalf, whether this should be proceeded with. And I think removing that provision is a constitutional deficiency so great that we are going to make a protest by voting against this motion today. Of course, we know that the motion will be passed, so our decision is not going to have any great effect in constitutional terms, but nevertheless, I think it is an important principle that politicians should keep their promises, and should be held to their word. And no reason that I've seen has been advanced for this decision. Nobody has made a positive case for not allowing the people to decide this issue. If so, I happily give way now, yes.
The reason we're not having a referendum is because they know that if they did have a referendum, they would lose.
Exactly. I think Mark Reckless, I think, is absolutely right. All lawyers are told never to ask a question unless you know the answer in cross-examination, and I'm sure that that is so in this case. So, just to conclude my remarks today, we broadly welcome the provisions that are in the bill, with the exception of that one. And it's with a really heavy heart that we should be voting against it today. This is not the end of the story. We shall be back once again, I'm sure, to debate these issues further and to take the devolutionary story further down the line.